Hi, and welcome to Art Lab, a podcast dedicated to conversations on visual culture with me, Kamayani. On today's episode, we have with us Shukla Sawant and Annapurna Garimella, founder trustees of the Culture Workers Support Trust, an organization set up in 2019 to, and I'm quoting them directly, spread awareness among culture workers about their rights and responsibilities. As someone who has worked in the art industry for a decade, I often seethe at the lack of support and protections that I see peers in other fields having access to. I too, dear listener, fantasize about running away to do an MBA. Culture work is unpredictable and unique to its practitioners in ways that most other kinds of work is not. And certainly it is carried out in circumstances very different from even other types of labor, which is also singular perhaps. Culture work, whether visual, textual, performance-based, musical or digital, I've probably left out some other format, is a lot more irregular in its configurations and devoid of many of the traditional comforts of a job, like say a skill commensurate salary band that's agreed upon within the industry, or material recognition of the value one brings to an organization or employer. It is the OG gig economy on crack, basically. The culture industry also operates according to and perpetuates socioeconomic stratifications and injustices. The comedy stereotype of, rich kids running art galleries, usually badly, exists for a reason. As I researched for this episode, I also came to realize that very little research has been done on art workers in India. I'd like to name check art geographer Christine Iturbide for her academic explorations of this topic and specifically give a shout out to the Legal Handbook for the Artist Community in India that she co-authored with lawyer Tejshri Savara. On the whole, even the acknowledgement of different kinds of roles in the industry is elusive, while artists and curators get their due. What about the artisans or craftspersons assisting them, helping them realize their vision? Or writers, administrators, publicists, conservators, technicians, and tradespersons with expertise in fashioning, installing, and activating art. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly note that we're not using the term culture industry in quite the sense that the Frankfurt School theorists did back in the 1940s. That original usage, as a critique of mass culture being an accessory of consumer capitalism, still holds theoretical potency, of course, and continues to make us aware of how wealth and profits govern culture making. However, on this episode of Art Lab, we use culture industry a bit more loosely to refer to the sphere of relations and infrastructures in which cultural labor occurs. Now let me introduce you to my guests, Shukla and Annapurna. Shukla Sawant is a visual artist and professor of visual studies, School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, where she has taught since 2001. She taught me as well, actually. Prior to joining JNU, Shukla taught for 12 years at the Department of Fine Arts and Art Education, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. She has also lectured as visiting faculty at the Bhautaji Art Museum, Mumbai, and at the National Gallery of Modern Art, New Delhi. Shukla has 10 solo shows to her credit and has published various catalogue essays and contributed chapters in books on contemporary Indian art. She is a founding member of the Indian Printmakers Guild and was a working group member of Khoj International Artists Association between 1998 and 2005. She is a founding trustee of CWSD. Annapurna Garimella is an art historian and designer. Her research focuses on late medieval Indic architecture and the history and practices of vernacular, visual and built cultures in India after independence. She is one of the founder trustees of Culture Workers Support Trust, or CWST. She also heads Jackfruit Research and Design, Bangalore and Hyderabad, an organization with a specialized portfolio of design, research and curation. She is also managing trustee of Art, Resources and Teaching Trust, an organization dedicated to research, archiving and pedagogy in the visual and built arts. On today's episode of Art Lab, we discuss the modes and methods by which labor in India's vast culture sector can start to organize and collectivize, how stakeholders across public and private sectors can come together for worker oriented solutions to entrenched problems, and how forms of workplace violence, including gender and caste based discrimination or harassment, such as that embodied by the Me Too movement in the art world, cannot be delinked from broader issues of labour rights, such as wage security and equitable contracts. We also discuss how, in the network capital dominated industries of the arts, legislative and juridical processes are necessary to enforce fair work conditions. Welcome to the show, Annapurna and Shukla. It's great to have you with us.
Great to have you with us too.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. I'm really glad that this has worked out and that you've both been able to give us time, particularly during this terrible period. So I just thought we could begin by discussing the work that CWST hopes to do, because I think most of our listeners may not know what exactly the organization is or what its mandate or vision is. So do you want to just take us through that?
So the Culture Workers Support Trust right now comprises of about 6 of us. And we came together in 2019 because there were multiple issues that had come up in the wake of the Me Too movement. And besides that, there were a number of conversations that people were having about not just the Me Too movement, but also about the kind of unequal relationships that exist in the field of culture work. And so first we, of course, set up this trust. And that trust was really an impromptu move because there was a legal intervention that we wished to make in one case. And nonetheless, it was a kind of an accretion of multiple events that had happened in the past and attempts to intervene in the field of how culture workers were being treated. And at least as far as the School of Arts and Aesthetics is concerned, these conversations had been going on for some time. There were students like Arnika, for instance, who had already organized a workshop around artist contracts several months before the Me Too movement even started, right?
Right.
And so one was aware of the kind of problems people in the field were facing. And when we came together, we wanted to create a platform that would be a kind of a nodal point where multiple organizations across the country could link together, a kind of an alliance, a culture workers support alliance. That's what we really felt eventually. That's what the shape that this organization would take. So we've had consultative meetings. We've had made some interventions where we've seen difficult situations arise for artists. We've also, been trying to collect material on the different kinds of contracts that can shape relationships in the field of culture work. We've been thinking of organizing panel discussions and workshops. So that's just a kind of a brief outline of what we've done till now. But the idea is to create some kind of an artist union along the lines of what the film world has done, like Cinta, which is also a kind of an umbrella organization that brings several different other unions together to create a more equitable space for people in this field.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that Shukla would also like to add is that our goal is to be pan-Indian across India.
Mm-hmm.
And right now we're just focused on the visual arts.
Right.
But eventually it would be really important to have a more integrated approach with other art forms and art practices.
Mm-hmm.
It's visual art because the people who are currently the trustees, that's Shukla Sawant is the settler. I am the managing trustee. Lokesh Khodke, Shafali Jain, Sindura D. Manjunath, and Vidyun Sabhani are also there. But we all come from the field of either making, curating, teaching, and researching and writing art, visual art or built art, architectural history, or these sort of things, craft. So this is our area of expertise, and also familiarity. Expertise is maybe sometimes a little exalted word, but I like the word familiarity because it's a little more humble. So this is our area of familiarity, and we know in many ways the nitty-gritties of what it means to work in this arena. Each form of culture work has its own complexities and possibilities and limitations. So to respect that, we would need to have other people here.
Right.
Also, I think the range of people who are the trustees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we are located in Delhi, Hyderabad, and Bangalore, and then we're hoping to involve people from other parts of the country into this. And we hope that people gain that sense of community and also that sense of that desire to change things that's specific to various locations, because what the conditions that prevail, let's say in a city, are not the same in a small town or even in a village, nor the kinds of opportunities and questions that come up in a city like Delhi, which is so intensely has so intensely aggregated culture work, is different from, let's say, a place like I don't know, Coimbatore or someplace like that. So it would be nice. However networked we are, we still acknowledge that there are deep differences in the way that things are being handled across the country. And there's also deep differences in the different kinds of visual art that are being made, right? Like people who make things in collectives have a very different experience of things like contracts and copyright and work load fairness and timings and all those kinds of things from somebody who works in an office situation, such as an art gallery or a museum and those kinds of things. And I think there are no ready-made answers for everything. So part of CWST's work should be to begin to even open up the arena for thinking and for conceptualizing the differences, not to create sameness, but to actually accept differences and work with them to create community and also like equity. Equity is really important.
So that's those are really comprehensive answers to the question of what the future for CWST might look like. Since you spoke about difference and diversity in the even among the trustees, at least in terms of their geographical locations, Annapurna, I do want to ask, like, in terms of the membership structure, could you shed some light on how you hope for that to evolve, and also in terms of the leadership or administrative positions, what kind of diversity or policies for inclusion are you hoping to implement? Because again, as we know with all sectors, but particularly in the culture sector, axes of marginalization like class and caste and gender, because it's an informal sector, they become more pronounced. So, and there are specific issues and challenges that people in those sociopolitical identities have to face. So, do you want to talk about how you hope for that inclusion or diversity or form of the CWST, how it might address those inequalities?
So we've had multiple discussions about how we go about creating a membership base, because we are very clear that we don't want this to be an organization that is supported by any kind of corporate interest, because I think that in some sense will already pitch the organization into one area, one kind of playing field. So we really want this to be a membership based organization where we keep it very low, the entrance membership fee very low. And of course, because there will be certain kinds of recurring expenses we'll incur, whether it's legal fees, whether it is just having a Zoom license to hold meetings and panel discussions and things like that. But I think we are very clear that this has to be a community organization where people feel a part of the organization in every sense, and that whoever runs this organization also this has to be on a rotation basis. We could also introduce perhaps a kind of an elected model, a representative platform. And these are things that we are thinking through right now. And we are only very clear about what we don't want to do, right?
Yeah.
So
So,
it's
and will you have like reservations as part of the
so
structure?
we are very clear about that as well, that we have to have representation from the entire spectrum of society, and there are certain constitutional provisions for reservations, right? And we feel that those have to be
Yeah.
implemented in not just spirit but also on the ground. They have to be implemented in the way the whole organization is structured. And right now, of course, we are collating material together. And I said the first, at the first instance, the trust was something that was that happened in a very spontaneous kind of a manner. People who were in one location, and we had to register the trust, and we were from diverse geographical locations and also across diverse social spectrums. I'd like to stress that. So this is really what we've been thinking through. We want, even in the consultative process, we've had many different people contribute to the conversation about how this organization should proceed. And in the future as well, after we've collated a lot of material, because we're right now looking at how such organizations across the world work and function. So whether these are organizations from South Africa or from the United States, we've been examining their constitutions, we've been looking at how they function, and we've collated a lot of material together, which we are studying, and we hope to table it in a much bigger consultative meeting.
Right, right. In terms of the, let's say, the constitution of the trust itself, of the organization itself, you're hoping to at some point make it public, right? And invite comments, I imagine,
Absolutely.
to make the process transparent as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the sense that we plan to have a series of consultative meetings, because we also know that there will be people who have opinions that are completely divergent from us. We do have some kind of, common ground. We believe in creating kind of an equitable world, and
Yeah,
our politics may differ. Isn't a right wing politics, for instance, right? So, even the conversations that we have, we want to ensure that it is people
yeah,
who really think genuinely about creating a more equitable world.
right, right. Right. I guess it's like Rawls said, the concept of justice versus the conceptions of justice. So you can have different solutions, but I think the abstract form, as you said, in this case, equity, needs to kind of be agreed on.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that I'm also interested in is, you mentioned different models, right, that you're looking at even abroad, and as one must, because there are maybe more mature contexts for these sort of formations and organizations elsewhere. And within India, you mentioned the Sinta, which has been around since the 50s. And you also mentioned the last time we spoke, the Indian Association of Designers. I was looking at both of their vision statements, and with the IAD, I sort of came across, this sort of attempt to also contribute to policy for consideration by the government. So I was wondering if that's something that you think that the trust might eventually move towards. Because I mean, also why I'm asking this question is that I looked up a couple of international labor organization papers on culture sector and media sector guidelines across the world, and somehow India does not seem to feature very prominently. And already you have a situation where labor laws are not a priority in this country at all. So I'm wondering how you see your relationship to policy intervention or that mode of advocating for members.
So I think we are interested in policy and impacting policy. I think that any culture work support trust worth its salt has to be engaged with policy work too. I think that policy, being engaged with policy work, means that you have to be willing to have the openness and maybe the flexibility and the intelligence to work within the system and with the system. That means the system that the government organizations, such as, let's say, the academies have, or relief programs, or museums, or even in the commercial sector, which would be galleries and stuff. Why I say this is, and why we all feel, I think, to some extent, in degrees, differences in degrees, not in substance, is that the number of culture workers in India is vast. It's huge. But the kind of infrastructure there is for structuring work, for creating spaces for impacting the conditions of work are very few, for contemplating and influencing the conditions of work are very few. And if we don't engage with all of these different realms, government, commercial, not-for-profit, and even one-on-one, because the biggest infrastructure in India is personal relationships for culture work. Let's be realistic. It's a one-on-one and academic as well. So all these spaces need to be engaged with, and policy needs to be very intricately and deftly engaged with.
Mm, mm. Yeah, because it's also, like it until something is enshrined in some enforceable terms, it becomes very difficult to maintain the momentum for it affecting the lives of people, in this case, culture workers.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense, if you look at the infrastructure, for instance, or employment opportunities, for instance,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we are taxpayers, and all the institutional infrastructure that exists in this country, the multiple Lalit Kala Academy
Mm,
venues, for
mm,
instance, that
mm.
exist,
Yeah.
right? The museums, etc. I mean, unless and until we engage with them, and if there are any kind of changes that have to be brought in, they can only be brought in from within and by contesting and challenging things that you think are going wrong,
Right.
right? So if we abdicate all responsibility and say that we're not going to engage with these institutions at all, in some sense, we are letting go of a very, very valuable resource, right?
Right.
And so how do we actually now, because that's actually what has happened, the academies, for instance, and also the various zonal cultural centers, they have vast infrastructure,
Mm,
right? And so how do we actually bring in artists who are living in small towns, living in cities outside the four metros? There are very active art worlds here as well,
mm.
right?
Yeah.
It's just that we don't have conversations, we don't link up with each other. But I think some of the kind of art educational connections that have happened because of multiple workshops that have been conducted due to, because of various platforms, and also because, I am in the academy, and I've been associated with multiple institutions. And these were central universities that had students from all over the country coming in.
Right.
It's a very vast net, and I think we need to mobilize that and work with people within these institutions as well.
Right. I think you raise a really interesting point regarding policy as also being something that's a result of conversations with public institutions like the Lalit Kala Academy, or like public museums, for instance, and also art schools and educational institutes, which are state funded, for example. But I'm also interested to know what kind of relationships it's possible for the trust to form with private institutions, like, again, private museums, galleries, and other cultural organizations that are privately owned. Shukla, I really think you should tell the story of the gallerist who wanted to have a publicity video made at no charge. Because I think that that's an important it's a good example to point to the way in which the relationship between capital owners and everybody else who's operating in this political economy of culture really is. There's such a stark difference in equity, and also almost no understanding of how the material conditions of culture workers and art workers across various strata really are.
So, the thing is that if you want to bring in diversity into conversations around culture and enrich it, from multiple perspectives, you have to understand that the young people who are coming into universities, getting the requisite qualifications to, write intelligently about culture, or, work within gallery space, or work as artists, or within the craft sector. First and foremost, you have to pay a living wage. I think a lot of the people who run private institutions, we were talking about that earlier, already sit on a lot of accumulated capital. They have no idea about how young people struggle, what it takes to just rent a room in a city, right? To even have the necessary infrastructure to participate, a computer or a laptop or a scanner or a camera costs money. You want a person to do work from home, for instance. If you want that person to work from home as well, that person will require a certain amount of infrastructure, and that requires investment, right? For example, you want a person to make a publicity film for your gallery, but you don't realize how much it costs to hire an edit suite,
Yeah.
right? And then you offer pittance to people who come from smaller towns to stay in the city and work for you as managers, gallery managers, or programmers, or whatever. But you have no idea how much your groceries per week cost,
Yeah.
right?
It's like they're really out of touch.
Completely out of touch. I mean, it's really shocking that people don't understand how difficult it is. And if you genuinely believe in creating an ecosystem and you want to invest in an ecosystem that brings in opinions and points of view from across the social spectrum, then you're going to have to support it,
Yeah.
right? And that's what is not happening, unfortunately. And I used to joke with my colleagues as well that most of us in fact have lived within 6 square kilometers of South Delhi. Most of the curators of a certain generation also lived within 6 square kilometers of each other in
Yeah.
Delhi,
Yeah.
right? So that in no way represents what this country is all about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you actually make the space a more inclusive one? And if it's inclusive, it's going to be more interesting,
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's
right?
like that George Carlin joke, right? It's one big club and we ain't in it. So I think like it's that logic. But I completely hear you, and I've struggled myself as a culture worker, as a writer whose craft is not valued by the market at all in India. And you really see the difference when you start contributing. At least I've seen the difference when I started contributing abroad. People can legitimately at least sustain a life just by writing. They can actually be freelance writers in in ecologies in the US and the UK, in Europe, whereas in India, in South Asia, it's impossible. It doesn't matter how good you are, because the market just doesn't value that labor. And also, like, I think this also brings me to a more historical question, and I think that you sort of hit upon it when you spoke about this kind of generational shift as well. I think one of the things that I'm curious about is how much, and both Annapurna and you have been in positions where you've seen that shift. So I think that both of you will weigh in on this. There's definitely been a casualization of, like, a marked casualization of labor, right? Since the 90s, since the post liberalization period. You can actually see that difference play out in the culture sector as well. The precariousness of labor has increased. This informal structure has only become more prevalent. And with the culture sector, historically, throughout centuries, it's been a patronage based model, right? What Annapurna said, that basically those interpersonal relationships constitute a kind of infrastructure themselves. So in this kind of patronage based ecology, which is already circumscribed by caste relations, patriarchy, this kind of massive class difference that you just hinted at, how do you begin to have these conversations? Even that's my question. I know it's a broad question. I think it's important for you guys to address it.
I'll say something. So I'm going to take you in a slightly different tangent in order to come to the place you want me to come to. See, if you think about before 1991, where exactly was there this kind of culture work? It's non-existent. So for us to talk about the casualization of labor as a recent phenomenon is to misunderstand what existed before 1991. There weren't these kinds of private museums. There weren't these kinds of opportunities that were coming from artists going abroad and showing abroad. I mean, very few Indian artists had the kinds of studios to employ the amount of labor, creative labor, that is now employed in the bigger artist studios, right? The more established and financially successful artist studios. So what we have is a situation where for the last 20 years, we are looking at the slow, in some sense, under imagination of an art world where it's only casual, right? It's there. It didn't become casual. It's being imagined as a casual world, right? It went from being, let's say, artist-driven, network-based, not necessarily. See, the slippage between network-based and patronage-based is very frequent, but they're not the same. So people's networks can come from their art school backgrounds, their shared pedagogical experiences. They could come from the fact that, for example, they come from the same place and come to a metropolitan location, like from Andhra Pradesh to Hyderabad or something like that, like rural Andhra Pradesh, right? So this slippage from having a network and moving into a patronage is not something of the past, it's of the present. This is, in some sense, how a network stops being relatively hierarchy free or limited hierarchy and starts gaining hierarchy. So some people want to control the network. So that's because the network itself is a kind of capital. It is capital to be able to leverage creative labor up and down the chain. We know so many situations where a foreign curator comes to India and they call them helicopter visits, where they land in Bangalore or more frequently Bombay or Delhi. And then like one or two key people in that network bring together a lot of other people who are at a site. And this is how the patronage network evolves. It's a completely contemporary phenomenon. It's not just like feudal caste and feudal this and feudal that.
No, I don't think I
No,
meant
I
that
know
at
you're
all.
not.
I think
know
I'm
you're
very much,
so,
I very much mean it in the sense that you're talking about.
Yeah. But it's also about the kind of art languages which are current, right? So that it's hard to speak about caste and art languages, but we have to find ways. Certain kinds of art forms become current, certain kinds of, it's beyond like taste and style. I actually want to see it a little bit more complexly than that. The second thing I wanted to say was that when somebody who has a lot of fiduciary capital, like monetary, hard cash, and property. So property is a big thing, right? Like if you want to show art, you want to showcase art, you want to store art, you got to have a big piece of land, or be able to afford a piece of land at the center of whatever you think is the center that you want to be at, right? So, but there's other kinds of capital. That is the capital that a person who knows how to make a good video has. Somebody who is able to put together a set of social relationships to make things happen. I think the problem in our world is that many of us, including me, I've gone through this experience, we don't value the capital we have. And when we begin to value it and we put it into a context where somebody who has hard cash, we don't know how to get them to understand this as a very serious resource. It's not just resource, it's capital that you have to learn to engage with in order for your capital to happen too, right? To have that kind of complex distribution of valuation. I think that's the word. So where would I learn this? I wasn't taught this at art school. I wasn't taught this at grad school. I learned it from suffering humiliating situations and being given some very beautiful opportunities as well, like some genuine care and respect, and also having the responsibility of caring and respecting for people who were younger to me or were in a different realm of the art world or doing other kinds of culture work. I'd like to stop there. I'm sure Shukla will have lots to add.
Yeah, so in the sense that, when you think of the amount of time that a person spends acquiring a certain set of skills. Today you have university programs and, people do their MPhil PhDs. They spend about, 10 or 12 odd years acquiring those skill sets. Now, if you take, for example, people in the sciences and think of how much a young graduate gets paid for doing entry level work, are our cultural institutions thinking of the humanities disciplines in the same way? Because we think they are extremely valuable. We think that culture work adds, the social sciences, the entire spectrum of social sciences has a lot to offer to society, right? And so, unless and until people who do have the capital learn to understand that this is very, very important work, I think we are not being able to position the kind of work that we do in the field. I think as an organization, we need to amplify what culture work actually does and what it can do and contribute to society. This is something that we really need to speak about over and over again. And that's the only way it is going to be given the kind of value that it deserves, right? And we've seen that happen across the world. Think, for example, of the museum cultures in other parts of the world, right? Think, for example, I'm not talking about the Middle East, but say, for example, Singapore. That has built up a huge infrastructure of museums. Again, we're not talking about a phenomena that Kavita has recently spoken of that happened in China, which could well happen over here, which is that museums were really about grabbing real estate.
Yeah.
Right. And most of these are museums that are empty shells today. Right. So it isn't as if culture work is something that has to sit in some kind of a brick and mortar kind of a location. There are multiple different kinds of avenues through which you can now create interesting interventions. But we of course we need the support, right? We need the support to have these conversations, to think, for example, of just what the Khan Academy has done, right? And so here is one person who is who's passionate about mathematics and the arts at the same time, and he is able to then build something on and scale up something like simple video lessons that he was doing, and you have support given to him by a corporate entity, and all the knowledge that's been produced has now been made accessible free across the world, right? So can we think of people contributing to creating those kind of platforms, and will they pay scholars well enough for them to have, to be able to make that kind of a contribution? So the Culture Workers Support Trust does want to, amplify these voices. And also, as far as creating equity in the field is concerned, I think even museums and private organizations, etc., need to know that they need to have a good, productive, and intelligent workforce. They need to also increase their support and give them the support that's due for their skill sets, right? So, I mean, when you talk about, Annapurna is right that the art world has changed a lot in the last 2 decades. When we were young, there was nothing but the Lalit Kala Academy, and nonetheless, you had galleries that you could hire, and we visibilized ourselves by, doing exhibitions. We would travel with our artworks in trains to different parts of the country, to our neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. And then, of course, setting up Khoj initially was something that engaged me for 7 years. And then, of course, creating infrastructure in universities, right? The School of Arts and Aesthetics is also something that one got an opportunity to shape from the beginning. But with the kind of increasing, gig economy, that has created its own set of issues because people don't have stable work. Their work is extremely precarious, and people find themselves very vulnerable. And sometimes I feel that because of this, people also hold back, right? Because the people who own the capital in some sense aren't willing to let go of what they've already put together. For example, suppose a young person wishes to write or do an exhibition that's critical of a collection that a person may possess. Will such a museum allow it in the first place? Right? But just by producing a kind of a critical text, you may even alter the kind of canonical understanding of art that we have, because that's what happens, when young people come up with different perspectives. When a more inclusive art world is created, you get many more different kinds of opinions being aired, and that's exactly what we need right now, right? And so even when we look at the different kinds of private organizations that have come up, some of them have been, they've also had very short lives themselves, right? And is that what they wish to do? Do they wish to leave behind a lasting legacy? This is something that they need to understand as well. And that can only happen, that lasting legacy can only happen when a kind of a critical infrastructure is also, is something that they also support. An independent critical infrastructure is what they also support.
I mean, I also think so. I mean, two or three things from, based on what both of you just said, just to take off from your last point. I mean, the fact that there is barely any sort of critical, autonomous context in which to even receive art, let's say in the form of a magazine, apart from, say, maybe Art India, or to some extent, Mark. You don't, and this is over like so many decades, right?
And take on art.
Take on art, yeah. But I mean, where is criticism really appearing on the Indian art scene? So there's no scope for any kind of critique, and it's one of the criticisms that I have, that actually it's a completely curator and artist driven space. So you don't have that kind of independent energy where people can really challenge the sort of canon or even the discourse that is being set by a certain group of people. So I think that this question of the establishment is part of what I was getting at when I framed the question into my original comments in terms of a patronage based model, because it does seem a bit like there has been a sort of mutation from from the feudal to the neoliberal, right? The fundamental structures and hierarchies haven't changed. It's not like there was some halcyon day before the liberalization era when there was a lot of diversity or like there was a lot of enabling or empowering structures within the firmament, but it's not as though those exist now anyway. There's no systemic change. And the other thing is also like, yeah, what you said about, symbolic capital, social capital, we know that those things are, of course, very important. Part of it is capital accrued in spaces like, Baroda or JNU, for example, or any of the premier art schools or, art departments, visual culture, visual art departments in the country. But yeah, I just think like it's also inextricable from all of those things like property ownership, land ownership, and the kind of aesthetic configuration that gets determined by that material capital, right? I mean, I'm also thinking of this in the context of, for instance, the CWST sort of being able to bring under its ambit, could it bring under its ambit a range of practitioners, right? Like, at what point do you make the distinction between an artist and an artisan? Are people who are, for example, working in artist studios often actually making the work based on the concept or design that the artist has issued? What kind of power do they have in this equation? Like, their names aren't even part of the work when it's exhibited, right? Or for instance, freelancers, or for instance, researchers on art and visual culture who actually are part of the a more a sort of an existing academic institutionality or infrastructure. So yeah, I'm just saying that there are all of these things at play as well. But and like, well, it's an aesthetic question as well. Like, what kind of aesthetic does property ownership generate, right?
So there are artists who have over a period of time matured as thinking persons about how they think about their own work and their own practice. So say for example, what does acknowledging a number of people who work with you in the projects that you do mean to the people who have helped you or participated in the project? Giving them credits means it's a way of acknowledging their skills, so that if they wish to apply elsewhere, they can say that I've assisted so and so, I've done this thing, and that enhances their employability, right? That's what cinema industry does. It acknowledges every single input.
Yeah.
And we've seen, for example, Neelima Sheikh, for instance, she gives credit
Yeah.
to all the people who participate in the kind of projects that she does. And it's by highlighting these kind of practices that we can open up conversations and also make people, maybe make them aware that this would be the fair thing to do. Right. I mean, in the sense that that's also one of the reasons why we're looking at Asinta as one of the organizations from which we can draw upon. But besides that, I think it's also important to understand that there are multiple arts organizations and collectives in places, for instance, in the Northeast. We know that, for example, there's a collective called the Bluebird Collective, which a number of young artists from the Northeast have recently initiated, right? There are also, there's this organization that we came across quite recently, which is not a formally registered organization, called Art Inside. This is a kind of a self-help group that came together some years ago, a couple of years ago, and were active during the pandemic in trying to just mobilize artists to come together. And there are multiple such organizations that are working outside the museum infrastructure, outside, any kind of. So most of the support comes from community leadership, solidarity economy. Somebody may have a house, somebody may have some equipment. Most of it is, put together just for that project. So there are many hundreds of such things happening, right? But we're also talking about people who need to earn a livelihood, right? So there is this kind of an art ecosystem, but what about livelihoods, right? So this is something that we need to understand, that there are also people who graduate from art schools and work as modelers, work as assistants in studios, set up their own independent photography practice, or a lot of sculptors, for instance, have gone into all kinds of very diverse practices, right? And they're not necessarily operating within the network of the gallery space, right?
Right.
So I mean, this is something. So what kind of support systems can we create? It could be simple things like health insurance.
I was going to ask about that because I think that was mentioned in one of the workshops that Arnika Ardag did. I think health insurance was brought up as a.
Yeah, so much of the work that people do in this field is simply dangerous for your health,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So do we create some kind of how do we even, because these are things that people don't discuss.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually looking at Cinta, and Cinta has like these guidelines wherein there's an amount of money that the union gives to people who've lost a family member to, work, film work, or, money that might be given in the case of injury by the association.
I mean, if you look at the mandate of the Lalit Kala Academy, they were supposed to do this, but now there doesn't seem to be any transparency or accountability,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
we need to
Push for that. And I
push
was
for
thinking
that.
of like how in the States recently there was this whole movement, within the museum space where museum workers were sharing there's these spreadsheets, which contained information about salaries that they were all getting. So it became a big thing in the United States and a big moment in their, kind of attempts to unionize as culture workers, or attempts to deploy transparency. Like, it's so true. Like, in the Indian art world, you don't know what anyone is getting. I've had so many conversations with, with peers of mine who work in administrative jobs in the gallery space or museum space, and nobody knows what the other person is getting. Everybody's skimping and saving, and it's a very strange kind of situation where there's no industry standard. So for instance, this asymmetry of information also creates a situation, and it does also, by the way, in the media industry, where people don't know how to bargain, people don't know how to negotiate because they don't know.
It's very, the lack of transparency is very disempowering.
Very, very.
Study after study has shown that the more transparency there is about such issues like salary and income and benefits and emolument,
Yeah.
there's a much healthier work environment,
Yeah.
and people stay longer at the positions, right? So yeah, I think that's very important.
So sort of taking off from that, in the middle class imagination, in the site of violence at the workplace is often limited to the abuse of power in sexual terms. And I think that, for instance, a lot of conversations about, in the culture sector and elsewhere, about workplace conditions started happening in the wake of Me Too across the world, really, but definitely in India. As we know, the problem of sexual harassment at the workplace is not independent of larger systemic questions of rights and protections, due labor, which we've been talking about. For example, against wage discrimination or along other axes, like caste. For instance, nobody's talking about the implementation of the Prevention of Atrocities Act, for example, in the workplace. It's almost like it's decoupled from the Vishakha guidelines or discussions about sexual harassment. So as though these things exist in silos. So, I was thinking about like how do you think of things like the ICC, for example, in this context? And like the fact that, for example, galleries on paper don't even have the requisite number of people to implement the Vishakha guidelines, like they can sort of get away with it. And questions of contract negotiations, or contract development. How do you think of these sorts of problems in this kind of a sphere? I mean, we've been having this discussion over the past, hour or so, but I think that we need more pointed, linkages to be made between these seemingly independent kind of sites of aggression.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is the focus of let me just make sure I get it correct. That the focus of conversations on violence is primarily on sexual
Or has been.
harassment, and
Has
then
been.
or has
Yeah.
been, and that has been siloed from other kinds of violence, whether it's cognitive violence. I think that's a really huge thing, or caste and class violence. And I think these are very good points that you raise, because I think often sexual harassment is intensely woven through all these other kinds of violences, or conversely, all these other kinds of violences are part of the infrastructure for sexual violence and sexual harassment to happen, right? The conditions and the framework. I think there's a lot that can be done. A lot that can be done. For example, developing CWST can help with this, I think, in the future as we progress and mature, which is there's things like legislating something, like making something enforceable, but we could also help certain good habits to come into the world, right? Habits are actually really very enduring, and they're accepted more easily. The habit of, for example, teachers acknowledging the role of their students in making certain projects possible. especially at places where project work is central to the pedagogical model, right? Like design schools are pretty well established in that kind of a model, right? So there is no, in the sciences, of course, there's a lot of work that's being done right now. A very beautiful essay in EPW from the students of sociology at University of Hyderabad have written about the complexities of mentoring and getting acknowledgement for their research work, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it still needs to be, we don't even, our conversation isn't even that far in our realm. So I think those sort of things, and I think when I would work in Bombay before, and I've worked in Bombay before, I don't know if it's the case anymore, but let's say 20 years ago when I worked there, people would look at you weird when you bring up issues of caste. Yeah. Like, what is that? That's something that happens in like Chennai or someplace else. It's not something that happens in Bombay, right? But over time, this has begun to become a conversation, and largely to the credit of people who've participated in the Dalit movement, or even Dalit artists and curators putting together things like what happens when somebody from the Chamar community decides to practice art or make an organization or whatever, right? So these are really important questions, and I don't think we can avoid them as an organization. I think we have to make those linkages, and that's part of the work that CWSD has to do. Yeah. It really has to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of institutional mechanisms and accountability, right? Once again, to come back to that word. And I think that just the fact that our society is organized in this way, and institutions reflect that. So it's also, when we talk about, not like this was one of my problems with some of the sort of aftermath of the Me Too movement, which in so many ways is embedded to neoliberal and capitalist frameworks, right?
So I do want to speak very specifically about the ICC and the sexual harassment laws that exist, and their applicability or inapplicability in the art world context. Mm. First and foremost, there is a certain kind of a mindset that exists because of the kind of patriarchal structures within which most of us have, kind of grown up. If you look at the art school environment, I like to give people this example of how, when Ram Kinkar Bed's retrospective was organized at the National Gallery of Modern Art, and three prominent artists and critics wrote monographs on him. Johnny M.L., K.G. Subramanian, and A. Ramachandran. All of them, on the book cover, foregrounded the artist-model relationship, in which the female model was, for me, it was really interesting to see this. I said, so it tells you immediately about the kind of, gender hierarchies that exist in the art world, right? So unless and until we keep these conversations alive about how the art world has been constructed, how artworks themselves have been informed through patriarchy, nothing's going to change. So at the institutional level, ensuring that gender sensitization workshops happen, creating a pool of lawyers who can take forward cases that people might want to register. That's extremely important for us as well, because some of these will never get resolved unless and until legal measures are, taken. We saw how with the, MJ Akbar case, it's only when she decided to step in and stand firm and, ensure that that case went, the way it should. I mean, you had lawyers like Rebecca John stand by this, woman journalist. So these cases will have to be fought. They will. I understand that it may be difficult for a lot of people who are not in a position to raise their voice, but the Culture Workers Support Trust wishes to be that kind of supporting platform that will raise its voice against these kind of difficult situations. But as far as an ICC itself is concerned, unfortunately, the law says that complaints have to be taken to local committees. Right. Right. And that's also one of the reasons why, and people know that many of these local ICC committees don't really function too well, and that's also the reason why you had the Me Too movement, in which complaints were aired in an anonymous fashion. Right. There was, that the social media. people have always complained to each other about misbehavior by others, and the social media just amplified this, right? And to ensure that all cultural organizations have have acknowledged the Vishaka guidelines, and also you know uh, convey these to the artists that are associated with them. It's important that everybody knows that these laws are there in place, and that it's important to adhere to them. We intend to organize to function as a kind of a pressurizing organization, and so it's important to make that noise. It's really important to make a lot of noise when you hear of something that's creating problems. So I think we do
Yeah.
think of ourselves as a kind of an organization that builds pressure. It's a kind of pressure group.
Yeah, I was thinking of the sort of statement of support that you put out at the time of the India Art Fair, when they
Yeah.
removed the works of those works that were critical of the government. But I mean, also, like, then the question really is, how much can one enforce? But maybe the pressure group starts really coming into sort of acquiring a kind of force when there are more people involved, kind of collective behind it, mass energy. One of the problems that I had in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, apart from it being embedded to some very problematic structures as well, is that interpersonal relationships are not really all justiciable in the traditional sense, right? You can't litigate interpersonal relationships beyond a point, and that's really the problem as well. And that gap is where so many people get away with abusing their power, because you can't frame all interactions in the language of the law, and nor should you be able to in an ideal world, right? A lot of these are very violent sort of ethical transgressions, but they're completely legal. So that kind of difference between the ethical and the legal is, I think, really important to note as well as we go forward, in terms of in both developing better relational hygiene, if you like, or jurisprudence even. And again, to go back to what we were talking about, this being a largely unorganized informal sector, where it's not always possible to enforce rules in the traditional sense, or policy in the traditional sense. A lot of the art is made over cups of coffee. A lot of curation is done like that, because someone knows someone, or someone decides to cultivate a relationship with someone. And
And I think fundamentally, somewhere there's also this sense of that there's a sense that the fundamental condition for being a modern artist is to be beyond rules. I mean, this is maybe going a little bit beyond the scope of what you're saying, but I think part of the response to a highly stratified, hierarchical, tacitly rule-bound social sphere that we live in is to constantly rebel or dismiss the idea that there's things like ethics in personal
yeah, that
relationships,
is
or
kind of the problem, right? Like, basically the
The issue is
interpersonal.
consent.
Yeah,
The
and
issue
more
is
than
really
that,
about
like,
consent.
consent is
it's
the
more than that.
minimum. Like, consent is
Minimum.
sort of the one necessary condition, but it's insufficient. I mean,
Because once consent happens, even to consent to work with
yeah,
somebody, that often sets up the stage for more violence. It's not like violence,
it's complicated. Yeah.
it's very complicated.
And it's also like a lot of these problems can't be resolved in the space of the legal, is what the argument is. They have to be resolved in the space of the social and the ethical. And that's really where the
Yes.
dilemma is, right? Because you can't
Yeah.
adjudicate personal relationships beyond a point. It's just human.
And also, we don't want the courts
Yeah,
in our
we
personal
don't, right? Like, for
relationships
instance, do you
always
want
either.
friendships to be for courts to adjudicate friendships? By falling outside juridical scope, friendships are relationships that are also then outside the purview of the state and the social norms it imposes. Um, and that can be very potent and threatening, especially in an endogamy-based structure like ours. The state wants to police love and the political possibilities it represents, because it's therefore a site of resistance and revolution. But of course, as we know, like, there's the toxicity is what it is, and we have to contend with it. But I think these are important questions to ask as we try to remedy these problems also, right? I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, of, like, even the case, the Subodh Gupta case, since you brought up, like intervening in the justice system. I mean, I know that CWST was one of the parties that filed a motion, right? That the case be heard in public interest, which is a very important point to make. But at the same time, once the court issued the order that, you either represent these parties or you make the affected persons part of the suit, there was an out of court settlement. So then it becomes very difficult to argue for any kind of feminist jurisprudence on how culture workers or unorganized sector workers operate, or the kind of protections that they're entitled to.
I think what the case actually did was that at least the party who had filed the case of defamation understood that many people in the art world would stand up and say that this is wrong. That it resulted in an out of court settlement is something for the party that was accused of defamation to answer for. We do know, however, that the lawsuit withdrew that 1 crore defamation demand, right? Or whatever that financial demand that was made on the person concerned. And also, I think if the person wants, the case can go back to court. That's the kind of loophole that's been left within that case. And I think it was important to make that intervention at that point in time because it was the result of a number of people responding to an email where, we had said that this is insane, so first that outcry.
Yeah.
That this is wrong because all that was required of a lot of people at that point in time who were in positions of power to just simply acknowledge that bad behavior was something that had been accepted by the art world for far too long and had never been addressed, and that simply acknowledging some kind of wrong and trying to change one's own behavior at that point in time instead of slapping lawsuits on people would have probably been the appropriate, what I feel would have been a mature response, and that didn't happen.
Right. I mean, I think that this is a case where you're actually seeing the distinction between the social and the jurisprudential. And here there was a jurisprudential opportunity to effectuate an actual material kind of impact on the lives of people. Of course, that didn't happen. But the fact that the case got the kind of attention that it did, and also generated the kind of community of support, that I guess is important as well. I think what was complicated about that was also how would things have been resolved, right? Because you don't have any kind of next step. Once a powerful person is called out, then what? A few months later, all is forgotten, and the people making those allegations are left even more vulnerable. So that if you're not linking it to the justice system when it matters, then people become even more vulnerable, and the perpetrators are let off. Nothing happens to them. So I think that is kind of, these are very important questions to think about, like where to make the decision to have a kind of to solve the problem within the sphere of the social, and where it's necessary to solve it within the space of the juridical. That's what I think.
I think that it's important to value all these various spheres for resolution and transformation and restitution. There are 3 things: resolution, restitution, and transformation. All these 3 things matter, and all these spaces should be available for this kind of work.
Absolutely. And they're not, unconnected,
mutually exclusive at all.
Of course.
Absolutely not. And I for that, I really respect the future of CWST for that alone. If CWST can become a space that continually advocates for restitution and resolution and transformation in culture work, it would be a task that's well worth doing and to be associated with.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think also this kind of a dichotomy that we see in the kind of positions that people may take in the artworks that they make and what they say through their artworks, and then even museums, the kind of artworks that they promote. It's the artworks are always talking about equity and a better world and what have you, and then what happens to your own behavior?
I mean, remember the Kochi Biennale scenario, the Kochi Biennale situation where, in 2019, the theme was possibilities for a non-alienated life. And then the company they'd been working with for prior editions as well, Thomas Cleary Infrastructures and Developers, served them a scathingly worded legal notice for not paying their workers who'd installed the pavilion and artworks. And other independent service providers like masons and plumbers, etc., also came forward with similar claims. Apparently, there weren't even proper contracts drawn up, just verbal agreements. And this was, gallingly in the aftermath of the Kerala floods as well. So local communities were already struggling. Now the Biennale, of course, the Biennale Foundation did issue statements to the effect that the contractors had inflated the number that the Biennale owed them, and that they weren't directly responsible for paying on ground workers. But the reportage at the time was that the previous top management staff that had previously worked for the foundation had, they also supported these allegations by the company, and talked about their own challenges while working with the Biennale. And articles at the time asserted that labor indeed hadn't been paid, and that's really contradictory when one considers the optics of the Biennale and its thematic commitments and the public positions that it took.
So that's why the insurrection that took place, when the guerrilla girls were making their intervention, I thought was a phenomenal moment, because everybody in that space stood up and showed solidarity with the Me Too movement. And that happened in the heart of the Kochi Biennale. I think was really important. And in some sense, all the conversations that happened subsequently as well. Yeah, I think it's just that it's important to, create that kind of a platform where we engage in self-critical kind
Yeah.
of engagement and look for transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I said, for me, I was just a bit disappointed that, like you have a situation where, yes, people, this is my critique of, or like a lot of people's critique of the Me Too movement, right? Like it's easy to stand, in some sense, it's easier to stand for solidarity with upper caste, upper class women, middle class women who, have been traumatized, of course, there's no question. But it's also like it's happening at the site where there's a massive labor violation happening. How is nobody linking the two and like having this conversation? Like it's egregious and truly shameful. So I mean that
I would like to say that as somebody who was involved with the Students Biennale in Kochi, every single point that you raised has been put down in writing and given to them by me.
I'm very glad. No,
Not
it's
just
so
about,
important.
but the entire spectrum of
Yeah.
issues that you've raised.
Right. No, I'm sure, and I'm really glad that this organization has sort of emerged in the wake of all of those discussions as well.
I think that's a moment of hope. I'd like to us to maybe conclude with, which is to say that I finished my PhD in 2002, and have been working professionally as an art historian since 2001 in India. I really feel like the amount of conversations, and relatively frank, that the younger people have started, I'm really, really respectful of that. I mean, there's some serious aggregation of courage happening. And I really
That's
love
a
that.
nice
I mean, I
phrase.
have a lot. Yeah, I think it's really beautiful. I mean, I used to feel a little bit like crazy. Like, doesn't anybody else see this shit? And I'm like,
And also, I think you also have to remember that there are a lot of really interesting organizations like the Round Table, Dalit Camera, etc., that
Yeah.
have come up, and these are platforms that have been created to voice
Yeah.
from a certain location, right?
Yeah.
And they're doing powerful work.
Yeah, you're right. So, just wanted to ask, in the context of the pandemic, is the CWST helping organize any mutual aid efforts or community organizing, community support?
not directly, but we've been trying to help other people organize themselves.
So let's put it this way, that when for example, Art Insight, this organization approached us, and they had already approached the Lalit Kala Academy. We've written letters to the Lalit Kala Academy because they are the ones with the largest network. Because we're talking about artists all over the country.
Yeah.
For example, when it came to ration distribution, we thought that would be the ideal location, nodal point for dispersal of say simple things like ration. People didn't have ration, people didn't have money to pay rent,
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, that situation is going to be really bad now that we are seeing lockdowns across the country again.
Yeah.
So so fundraising. I mean, we've had certain technical issues because of which we have not been able to start. We don't want to be a kind of a fundraising organization because that is not what we are thinking ourselves to be. Right.
Got it.
Also, there are some other organizations who are focusing on the fundraising in the art and the culture work realm.
Yeah.
I think there's some benefit to just making sure that the flow of pressure is directed at appropriate targets.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. Sounds like some hydraulic activism. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So thank you so much for taking interest and having us.
Thank you, Kamayani, and all the best with your endeavor.
Thank you for tuning into Artalap with Shukla Sawant and Annapurna Garimella, in which we discuss the work of the Culture Workers Support Trust and the complexities and challenges of art labor in India. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alap and on Twitter at artealaap. Before I go, I want to take a moment to send strength and support to our listeners as we in India battle the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you and those you care about stay safe during this time. A reminder too that direct messages on Artalab's social media, Instagram and Twitter are open if you want to share resources, especially if you're an arts and culture organization wanting to spread information about relief initiatives.